So maybe I'm going to try to speak in English. If we can, if we manage to speak in English this morning, it would be good because Dan, who is here, will speak in English. So we are going to start the third day of this conference. Thank you very much for the people who are still on Zoom, despite of the many difficulties that we had during the past days. So we hope this morning will be okay, and we are going to start this. So the morning will be we will focus on the question of the political consequences of organology. So the question of, let's say, what technology is doing to politics, to rights, to juridical and geopolitical questions. I'm sorry for the English, which is not very precise. But so we are going to start with Daniel Ross, who is a philosopher, who is also a filmmaker, who is also Bernard Stiegler's translator. So he translated many work of Bernard, and he made the famous film, which is The Easter, in which there are lots of philosophers who are, yes, I won't say anything more about The Easter because I'm not ready for that now. So I let you speak, Dan, and okay. Then we will listen to Antoinette Rouvroy, and we will have a debate, and then Paolo Vignola and Sara Baranzoni. Okay.
Okay. Good morning to everybody, and also good morning to all the little people in their little homes there. Thank you for joining me, and I want to start by saying thank you to the organizers, and especially to Anne for making it possible for me to come here from Australia. It's been fantastic, and I really appreciate having this chance. Okay, so today I'll try to introduce a little idea into the thought of Bernard Stiegler. And maybe this idea is not so important. Maybe I don't know exactly what are the consequences of this idea, and maybe they're not so much. But as Marshall McLuhan once said, if you don't like my ideas, it's okay, I have others. And it's a way of trying to think about some of the questions of law and politics as they relate to Bernard's work and in its relation to contemporary existence. As you know, of course, Bernard's idea is that from the moment that organic life becomes organological or exorganological, it introduces instability into life. Or as Congolais would say, inconstancies of the milieu. And this instability is caused by the introduction of techniques, which tends to coalesce into technical systems which stabilize but also unstabilize. And this instability at the beginning is very slow and not really perceptible to anybody who is living through it, but nevertheless introduces the need to regulate and metastabilize and take care of the inconstancies of the milieu. And law is the social and the technical mechanism by which this metastabilization of social life is pursued in the face of this instability and this inconstancy. And in particular, for Bernard, it's important that law is the mechanism for doing so once there's not just techniques, but upomnesic techniques, or in other words, more particularly writing. And law is a mechanism that really occurs once writing is invented, and not only invented, but becomes shared amongst a public, who in this way becomes a public, capable of reading and writing, as he says. Politics then is a struggle for agreement in relation to this metastabilization, and this becomes necessary because the literate public who reads and writes tends to disagree about the way in which to do this. But at the same time, law is also, for Bernard, the name of a very general way in which this need to regularize the relationship to the future involves a kind of performative synthesis that exceeds the analysis that is also made possible by these ways of reading and writing. In this way, the question of law for Bernard is always also a question of knowledge and desire in general, which are the names that he uses for this relationship to the future in its most general sense. Today, there are two fundamental ways in which law becomes a problem, if we think through Bernard, that we have to turn into a question, and that are both the result of the vast increases in speed that have occurred. In other words, the speed of the inconstancies of the milieu, brought about especially by digital technical systems, compared, for example, to the writing systems on which all legal systems are based. The first is the fact that legal systems seem powerless to make any significant difference to the way in which large digital platforms take hold of and exploit the data and consciousness of users. Because we can imagine law trying to do this, and efforts can be made. We can simply make them pay for data or break up the vast monopolies. After all, the oil companies in the United States learned a long time ago that it is possible to use the antitrust laws in the United States to change very large companies in a very strong way. But this seems to be impossible in the case of the monopolies that we're talking about here. Let alone to outlaw this kind of thing. So there are many legal strategies, but none of them really have made any kind of dent in the way in which these platforms have evolved. This is a problem. It's a bit like the tobacco industry. Governments never succeed in, or even try to eliminate tobacco, because a product to which people are addicted in significant numbers cannot win elections with this policy. So instead, small measures are introduced, banning advertising, adding taxes, etc., to try and create a generational difference that makes it ultimately possible to imagine the elimination of this harm. The second reason that law finds itself challenged as a regulatory mechanism is related to this, in the sense that, as Bernard argues, what digital algorithmic technologies do is like a drug, in the sense that it produces something that you need better than you can produce it yourself, and therefore you forget how to produce it yourself. And when this becomes a cycle, it means that you need the drug to compensate for the fact of this forgetting. These platforms function in just this way. As Bernard always argues, as you know, in automatic society and so on, that operates faster than the nervous and cerebral processes of the human body, short circuits desire and knowledge, and structures the relationship between the individual and collective future in advance. What that means is that all of the practices of knowledge that are necessary for the functioning of law, such as analysis, deliberation, decision, and so on, are incapacitated. So how can law respond to this? Given this short-circuiting, this outstripping, overtaking, and so on, because of a question of speed. Now, I said at the beginning I want to introduce, tell me if I go too long. I said at the beginning I want to introduce a little idea. All of what Bernard thinks, as you know, is based around the idea that there are three kinds of memory. Where memory is what? Memory is the way in which the improbabilities are kept in the present against the tendency towards the probable. The past is kept in the present in order to facilitate the organization of the future. And his argument is that there are three kinds of memories. Three kinds of memory. Genetic, the DNA molecule, as you know, which is conserved across generations but cannot learn lessons except by mutations and changes very slowly as a result. Secondly, nervous system memory, the brain and the nervous system that we ordinarily think of as memory. And third, tertiary attention, exteriorization, all of the things that you know very well, so I won't talk about that any further. What I want to suggest is that there is a fourth kind of memory, a fourth way of improbably keeping the past in the present in order to maintain the consistency of the organism. That fourth kind of memory is the immune system. The immune system is and this is, I should say, this is an idea that I got from reading Francesco Vitali's book on biodeconstruction, and because of the way he talks about contemporary science of the immune system in relation to Derrida and so on, and the way in which this system of the body, which has many functions, but which we know very well what is the main function, literally works by cutting off molecular strands of bacteria, virus, and keeping them in order to then recognize in the future what, whether something is a friend or an enemy, let's say. It seems undeniable to me this is a fourth kind of memory, and it's a retentional system in this way, and it's connected with the organization of the future of the organism. Because this is a question of friend and enemy, because it's a question of the foreign and the invader, it's natural that there's a lot of suspicion about the idea that we can use the immune system as a metaphor or a paradigm for social and political existence. And that's totally justified. But what I want to suggest is that when we view it primarily and first of all as a fourth kind of memory, as a retentional system, then what matters is not so much the issue of friend and enemy, but another question, which I'll get to. But before that, why do we have an immune system? We have an immune system, again, because it's a question of speed. Genetic change occurs slowly, but in the milieu there are inconstancies that generate new differences rapidly, because the generations unfold very rapidly compared with the generations of the vertebrates that have evolved to have immune systems. It's a question of speed. And so it's, so is the nervous system, but in this case it's not the nervous system at all, because you are not, there's no connection between these. I don't know, maybe there is some connection, but to me there seems to be no connection between the nervous system and the immune system in terms of what they sense and what they retain and how they communicate. A political constitution, a document, the Declaration of Independence, is like DNA in this way. It's designed to change slowly, and it deliberately changes slowly. Because if it changes too rapidly, it will turn into a monster. And this is a pharmacological condition, because you can become a prisoner of what doesn't change very rapidly at all in a milieu that begins to change very rapidly. For the first 200 years of the United States, maybe the Constitution is fine. But when very rapid technologies begin to change the technical system, the fact that it can only change slowly, and the fact that law also progresses at a certain pace, becomes a constant lag. And this is very strongly connected to the fact that law constantly fails to adjust to these inconstancies of the milieu. In other words, Bernard's idea is that there are, what we have to do is introduce mid-scale experiments that will cause something to bloom, that can deal with this problem of speed differentials between law and politics and technology today. But many of those mid-scale experiments ultimately have in their idea, as far as I can see, that they involve regulatories, you know, the MICE and all these things that depend on political and legal process for institution. So a question has to be asked, is there a kind of avoidance of this question of the speed differentials? I know one answer would be, things can happen infinitely fast because of the circuit of desire and so on. But it's still a practical question in some way. Okay, if I have some time, I want to, I want to say some other things, but I'll sort of shorten them. There is not only autoimmunity that was so interesting to Derrida, which is when this system begins to function in a way that it attacks the body. There is also anaphylaxis, which was of interest to Canguilhem as the idea of a kind of shock reaction of the body. But where Canguilhem emphasizes that this is not an opposition between ordinary immune function and anaphylaxis, that these are two kind of normals. He says, while immunity makes the organism insensible to an intrusion of microbes or toxins in the inner environment, anaphylaxis is an acquired supersensitivity. The presence of antibodies in blood serum is thus always normal, the organism having reacted by modifying its constant to a first aggression of the environment and being regulated by it. But in one case, the normality is physiological, in the other, pathological. So the question here is supersensitivity. And what I'm saying to you here is the issue of sensitivity relates to the issue of being a attentional system, because it's a question of interpretation. Anaphylaxis is a misinterpretation. Anaphylaxis arises from the fact that the immune system, as an interpretive system, it has to recognize, this is more important than the question of friend and enemy, is the fact that it has to recognize differences. And it can get it wrong. It can get it wrong because it is a sensitive system, not just in the sense that it senses, but in the sense that it's highly sensitive. And I think this can relate to the question that we saw yesterday of the third dimension of the pharmacon that Stiegler raises in Pharmacologie du Front National, the dimension of the pharmakos, the scapegoat. Why exactly does the pharmacon produce the pharmakos? Why exactly does it produce the common enemy like this? We can talk about it in terms of Carl Schmitt, of course, but I think the most fundamental thing is that it's a question of interpretation. And it's a question of the possibility of interpretation regressing to paranoia. So now I want to tell you an idea about paranoia. Why do people become paranoid? When somebody talks to us and says a sentence to us, let's take an example, a sentence like, you know, I think you're really a very good person. How do we know what they mean? We know the words, right? But if I say to you, you know, I think you're a really good person, then you might start to think I mean something else. Right? In other words, you're interpreting multiple layers of meaning at the same time, most of the time without being aware of it whatsoever. And it's highly sensitive. In something like paranoid schizophrenia, a lot of the time what happens is the person's first symptoms are they start to feel they're not sure what people mean when they say things, and something's going on and something's not right, but they can't put their finger on it. And then there's what's called the aha moment, when everything crystallizes into one meaning. Then if I say to you, you know, you're a very good person, you immediately understand what I'm telling you is that the Russians are trying to kill you, or the aliens are trying to kill you, or Emmanuel Macron is trying to kill you, or something like that. In other words, when this sensitive system starts to malfunction, it produces impossibility of interpretation that then defaults to one single interpretation. And I'm saying that this supersensitivity issue is related to the production of the pharmakos. When everybody starts to agree in their diversity of conspiracy theories and so on. And it's because it's a sensitive system, like the immune system, and it's not a centralized system. It's not a question of when I touch something very hot and a message is sent to my brain and then back down to my muscles. It spreads mimetically more than through a backwards and forwards centralized messaging system. So what difference does this make? Good question. If it's a question of sensitivity, it's a question, and of the spread of sensitivity, it's a question of resonance. It's a resonant system rather than a backwards and forward system. And this is a question of tension. To resonate requires tension. A tension of possibilities that makes possible the sensitivity of interpretation that inhabits this tension. Tension between two people, between generations, between men and women, and so on. To say that it's a tension is to say that it exists in a supersaturated field, as Simondon would say, of possible meanings. That is the condition of possibility of noetic diversity. We have to think about diversity in the right way. Diversity is a question of the supersaturation of noetic possibilities. But it can always crystallize into anaphylactic reactions. Why I'm saying this matters is because tension is what is being lost. The idea that that tension is a positive pharmacological condition is being lost. And when that is lost, it turns into war. Instead of saying it's good that there's tension between me and a woman, or between the generations, me and my father, tension turns into war. And so the significance of what I'm saying, if you believe that it is significant at all, is that the meaning of peace is the possibility of the reinflation of what are collapsed tensions. We need to have a positive pharmacology of tension. And this is the condition of peace, not an opposition to war, but a tension that always is at risk of turning into war, and that is our struggle to maintain. So I think probably I should stop there, yeah?
Yes, if you want to conclude, you can conclude.
No, I'll stop there.
It's okay.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much. Then I think you raised many different kind of questions, I think. So, but we will have the time to discuss about all of them just after Antoinette's talk. So maybe you can sit there if you want. I will sit here. And we are going to listen to Antoinette Rouvroy now. So first I want to thank you very much, Antoinette, to be there, to be here, sorry, with us today. It's a great honor for us, and it's really good to be able to meet in person too. And so, yes, I have to speak in the text. Bon, ça marche, So, Antoinette Rouvroy, certainly you already know her. So she's a philosopher, and also she worked in the field of philosophy of law, and also a jurist. I don't know how we say that in English. A lawyer. Okay, sorry. And she's working at Namur University, and she's searcher at the FNRS and at the Center of Information Law Society. Okay, so I let you speak, Antoinette.
Yes. Thank you very much for having me, and I have to apologize first because I'm not a philosopher at all. I'm just a very bad lawyer turned into something that is more indisciplinary than interdisciplinary. So sorry about that. I will certainly disappoint you, and it's an immense honor and also a very intimidating honor to be able to speak with you today and be with people whose work has been so influential, including in thought the work of Bernard Stiegler. By way of homage, I don't know even how to tell it in English, I'd like just to read that little sentences from Gilbert Simondon, who wrote and sorry, that will be in French, in L'individuation, la lumière des notions de forme et d'information. Gilbert Simondon said, he wrote that il se peut que quelque chose de l'individu soit éternel et se réincorpore en quelque manière au monde par rapport auquel il était un individu. Lorsque l'individu disparaît, il ne s'anéantit que relativement à son intériorité, mais pour qu'il s'anéantisse objectivement, il faudrait supposer que le milieu s'anéantit avec lui. Comme absence par rapport au milieu, l'individu continue à exister et même à être actif. Au moment où un individu meurt, son activité est inachevée et on peut dire qu'elle restera inachevée tant qu'il subsistera des êtres individuels capables de réactualiser cette absence active, semence de conscience et d'action. And I believe the fact that we are all here is attest to the presence of the illimitation of Bernard and his survival in a way. Apart from this, I'm afraid I will be very unfaithful to his thoughts. As I am always, being a lawyer, I don't feel very much constrained by obligations of faithfulness to the authors that I use. First, the title I had intended to give to my presentation, which previously was written in French, but then it was decided this morning to switch in English, was Algorithmic Gouvernementalité versus the Matters of Law, from Enlightenment to Apocalypse, ... and back, ? Because we don't know really. So, first of all, a few elements of context. Of course, the subject is huge, but I think the problematization that I have been trying with a kind of obsession for some years now around algorithmic governmentality attests first to the radical crisis of representation. I think this is something we all know now. Representation is not admitted anymore. Even categories, statistical representations don't appear predictive enough, don't appear objective enough and value neutral enough and ideologically pure enough to be the basis for political deliberation and also for governing the world. There is also a decline deterministic metaphysics, but I will come back to that later on, when I will try to show how far removed we are from the projects of a compatriot who was Adolf Kettler, a statistician, who really was in a more deterministic metaphysics. What we see now is really a kind of absolutization of something else, an absolutization, I will argue, of contingency. Contingency rules everything. Not even probabilities, not even statistics, not even anticipation. And for that, I will work a little bit against my previous work here. But contingency as such. Also, and that's something I will assume, I believe with Nick Land, who said that there is a teleological identity between cybernetics and capitalism. And for example, the recent example of Elon Musk. Elon Musk for me is the alias, is the proxy of digital capitalism. He represents the last immunization and recombination of capitalism, whose tour de force is to have installed speculation and ungovernance rather than governance at the heart of governmental rationalities. That's the reason why also Alexander Galloway said that deterritorialization, the rhythm, that revenge of the plan of immanence over the plan of organization, in fact, is something much more territorializing, and less, in fact, less deconstructive in a way than all we had thought. There is a kind of vitalism, a kind of vitalism that negates all kinds of objections, of all kinds of objects capable of objecting, that is limiting the bulimic, the appetites of those who replace now what we call the sachant, the puissant being the vectorialist class that Mackenzie Ward has described. That vitalism is also a kind of hyper-narcissism in the psychoanalytic sense described, for example, by Anselm Japp in La Sociétés, automatiques. It means that the individual is confined at an archaic stage, pre-Oedipal of psychic development, and he doesn't have even access to object relations, object apart from himself. And we see that in the taste we have for personalization, the hatred we have for being part of an average. We really want to be profiled, individualized, and so on. It also means that the algorithmic governmentality is not something that is imposed on us from somewhere. It's something we all really want and desire. It corresponds completely to our desires. It's what Aaron Schuster even said, that capitalism is a humanism. In fact, it's the humanism that corresponds to our current actuality. This being said, no, I will try to switch to a more correct English if I can. I'm not sure about that. So what I would like to try, the ideas I would like to put to test today, is the idea that the prospects of rationalization, or some things that some people call neo-rationalization, as Luigi Pellizzoni calls it, accompanying the algorithmic turn, promising an hyper-agile, automatic algorithmic governance of the social in high resolution, which is also high dissolution. Bernard would call it grammatization, of course, and discretization. At the pre-semiotic scale of the digital data, of course, resurrects the revolutionary utopia of a full transparency of the social, which Jean Baudrillard had described in La Transparence du Mal. A full transparency of the social, emancipated from the yokes of representation, the biases, the limitations of human languages, images, categories, perspectives, and interpretations. It has by now widely been documented and acknowledged, though, that this shift from representation to computation, by what we can mean compression, correlation, recursions, and the ambitions to replace differentiation systems, what Michel Foucault called the divisive practices, reflecting antecedent relations of power and phenomena of domination, gender, class, ethnicity, status, privileges, socioeconomic advantages or disadvantages, and so on, replacing all this by dynamic I mean recursive systems of differences set in a way apparently endogenous to the social mediatic computable reality, through ranking, scoring, profiling, and so on. All this is prone to naturalize and recursively regenerate most effects of antecedent dominations, attesting to what I propose to describe as a shift from normativity, with all the strategic characters of normativity, to facticity. And I use the term facticity in a way a little bit different from Bernard. And that's the apocalypse that I mean. By apocalypse, I don't mean the end of the world. I mean the way we risk staying at the obscene scale of amnesic immanence. That's apocalypse. That's the reason why I quite agree with Slavoj Žižek, who said in the 20th century we were a bit too eager to change the world. Let us take a step back. Let us once again interpret the world, because it's in that way that we can maybe, with a question mark, avoid apocalypse. In this contribution, thus, I take a step aside from the currently dominant trends in what is called now algorithmic governance and not algorithmic governmentality. I take distance from, first, the techno-reformism, which is a term aptly coined by Andrew Culp to describe the position that the problems that arise from a given technology can be reversed by way of intervention on that technology, for example, addressing algorithmic discrimination by using different training sets, or more generally through the design of fair, accountable, transparent machine learning algorithms. And I also take distance from the rise of ethics that Luigi Pellizioni described as a flexible way of governing without law by making law and ethical norms increasingly blurred. So I would say less ethics, less techno-reformism, and more politics. Indeed, I will argue, if algorithmic realism, by which I mean, in fact, algorithmic apocalypse, in the way algorithmic non-interpretation, appears at odds with the matters of law, a law, as you said, which is a linguistic sedimentation of codes and interpretations in a culture of interpretable science and readable text, there are also other materialities than textual materialities that are obliterated by algorithmic realism, the space-time of political and legal individuation or subjectivation. This contribution then proposes a critique against algorithmic governmentality, which is based on the heterochronicity and the relational ontology. We can think of Catherine Malabou and her materialism of encounter, relational ontology of the legal and political subject. This, taking Mark Fisher's invitation seriously, we need to build a critique that is not nostalgic for older representations and so on. That's finished, I think. We will not go back to causation and representation, but building a critique from a future that hasn't arisen. And for that reason, I will plead for the Constitution, because the Constitution is the materiality of, it has the textuality as its technique, and for that reason, indeed, I agree with all that you said, but I will go back to that later on. I take this occasion also to try to explain why I use gouvernementalité. Why gouvernementalité? In fact, gouvernementalité is, it seems to me, and I'm probably unfaithful to Foucault in that way, gouvernementalité is, it seems to me, above all, a methodological position that makes it possible to detect the series of semiotic, epistemic, normative, strategic, anthropological, ethical shifts that characterize the present. In this way, it's a kind of critique, of course, it's very Kantian. It's to characterize the present at a distance from the classical invariants of political science, the state, institutions, the subjects. Gouvernementalité does not, in this sense, in the sense I take it, designate a particular mode of government or a particular epoch, which would have more or less succeeded or been juxtaposed to the forms of sovereignty, pastorate, discipline, normalization, control, and so on. Gouvernementalité is the name of a certain analytics of power, of a symptomatology of the contemporary. In any case, this is how I inherited this Foucauldian concept. It is in this sense that I have seized upon this notion of gouvernementalité to try to diagnose the new spirit of digital, post-liberal, post-phenomenological capitalism under algorithmic steroids. Despite being most of the time associated with ideas of rationalization and control, or as standardization of behaviors, algorithmic gouvernementality is not, in fact, a mode of ordering of the world. It's not a new world ordering mode. It is rather a mode of disordering of the world, allowing for the artificial leveraging of the future at the price of the to come. I mean that the digital space, the purified digital space, that complete deterritorialization is absolutely not equivalent to what Deleuze and Guattari said, a non-striated space. It's not only that it's striated because it naturalizes all the antecedent effects of power and dominations, but it's plissé. How would you say that? It's folded. It's folded because machine learning. How does it work? What does a machine learning algorithm? Machine learning algorithms, in fact, they discover with a kind of artificial curiosity, they detect correlations in huge amounts of data, correlations without causations and so on, but their artificial curiosity is tamed by something or domesticated by something important, which is the objective function of the algorithm. And the objective function of the algorithm is the point of view of It is the point of view. It's not a system without point of view. The point of view, meaning also the authority or the position of the subject, is taken by that the objective function. The objective function represents the utilities, the organizational utilities, the surveillance interests of those who decide of what will be considered as a cost and what will be considered as a gain. So it's not at all a system devoid of. It's not an anarchic system. It's everything but anarchic. Power is taken over by something which hides itself as power, but however, it's very much there. But the novelty, indeed, is that it's a mode of government that does not rely on norms, nor produces norms, and that's completely novel. It leverages on uncertainty. If if you will, what Elena Esposito calls an ecology of ignorance. Ignorance is not something that reduces the intentional action, the possibility of intentional action. It's exactly the opposite. That's the reason why when Bernard Stiegler says, well, there is a general proletarianization, it has the connotations for me that everybody has lost any kind of power. It's absolutely, from my point of view, untrue. We are not all equal, and it's a very powerful means of taking power over the future for those who can manipulate the algorithm. So it's not it's a way rather to enlarge our possibility of action rather than a loss of control. So when digital data and patterns detected by algorithm in deterritorialized, big and above all fast data, it's fast, so it doesn't retain much. It's opposite to what we believe. Big data is a general memory of everything. Not at all. It's very fast, and data becomes very quickly very obsolescent. When they become the new privileged coordinates of social modulation, the topological, territorialized architectural visibility premise on the visual perceptual episteme, discipline of body and mind, and specularity as reflexivity, anticipative conformity, social subjection, give way at the core of governmental rationality to speculation, leveraging of uncertainty, and preemption. So I heard what you said, Paolo, yesterday about, we should not oppose too much disciplinary power and control and control. And I agree to that up to a certain point, but not to the end for the reasons I said. So I will obviously not be able to describe in full length here what the type of society or the type of imaginary disinstitution of society, such algorithmic intermediation of production, knowledge, power, and subjects produce. Just a few words about these that should be read as nothing more than an expressionist indications of that new spirit of digital capitalism. What does it say? How much time do I have?
I think you can speak 10 minutes.
Okay, I hurry up. Transformations of techniques of signification. I will have to rush a bit, sorry about that.
No, but 15 minutes will be okay too.
Okay.
I mean, don't...
I will rush a little bit.
Okay.
Transformations of techniques of signification, because as you said, I use Foucault's notion of good governmentality, or what he calls governmental rationality, is above all a way of making consistent or showing the intrications in each era of a set of techniques of signification, techniques of power, and techniques of the self. So I will have to describe very artificially, because in order to be able to expose them, I have to cut this in slices. Sorry about that. So the techniques of signification. In an algorithmic regime, neither the distinction between what has value of signal, meaning attribute or variable, and what has not, what is considered as noise, nor the intensity and relevance, by that I mean the decisiveness or the weight of each signal, depend on any explicit recognizable institutional system. It depends rather, as I said already, on endogenous dynamic self-learning processes of differentiation, ranking, scoring, pairing, profiling, targeting, tamed by the algorithm's objective function. With dataism, which is the specific anesthetics, I can explain why I consider it's an anesthetic and not anesthetics. With dataism, the specific anesthetics of algorithmic governmentality or digital capitalism, the visual and the linguistic episteme, the drive to document, test, and prove by reference to physical material ground truth, falls in value in favor of the digital algorithmic regime or reliability without truth, where one ceases governing on the basis of knowledge, knowledge power, as Foucault would say, and begin instead leveraging uncertainty through continuous machine learning and recursive feedback loops. In such a regime, hierarchies, scores, and so on appear never stabilized, normalized, sedimented, or structured, subjectively recognizable. They are always in a process of dynamic unfolding and becoming. In that way, you see, it transcends a little bit the distinction between form and substance. It goes very well hand in hand with what Karen Barat calls, for example, metaphoricality. Metaphoricality. The designation is really generative of a new reality. It's not descriptive of anything. It's not a system of signified and signifier. It's not a question of description of an object, representation, and the object. It's really ontological. It generates something completely new, which is highly performative. As for the techniques of power, so as I said, what we discover with algorithmic gouvernementality, and I repeat it because I think it's one of the novelty, it's an unprecedented disordering world system, fraught with power and domination phenomena, but which are not easily identifiable as such, that does not produce norms nor rely on norms, but on the contrary, feeds on anarchic, lawless dynamics, on the plasticity of the living, of the world, of particularity. So it feeds on plasticity. As for the techniques of the self, where the dynamic systems of differences, according to which individuals are evaluated against, are apparently set in a way endogenous to the social mediatic reality and recursively evolving rather than imposed from above, the kind of subjects required and generated by algorithmic gouvernementality are recombinant rather than recalcitrant, where in their race for credit, people feel exposed less to the threat of social visibility than to the threat of social invisibility. So you see, we all want to become capitalists. We all want to be digital capitalists. And we are shifting from the model of Homo economicus, because the Homo economicus could still calculate what kinds of investment in his human capital would give him returns in the future. Now, as the metrics are evolving in real time, are becoming completely plastic, and there is a kind of anomy, people are not even able to calculate. That's what Jean-Luc Nancy said recently also. People cannot even calculate anymore. Everything has become incalculable. And then what replaces the former normativity is the subjection or subjectivation to the norm is an inextinguishable thirst for credit. Credit is everything. So I have I had a lot of the things, but we can maybe discuss later on. What I would say is that maybe that power, which is, I think, something that maybe Bernard was not so interested, in fact. He was not so interested in power. He was very much interested in knowledge, but maybe less in power, you see? And that's maybe the reason why he considered all these digital technologies as pharmaca, you know, with the idea that maybe you can turn them in something good, but you cannot turn them in something good if you don't consider the materiality of the power relationships where you are playing. Huh? But power is shifting in two directions at least, I think. On the one hand, you have all the vectorialist class who is now able, thanks to uncertainty, contingency, and so on, to leverage contingency and produce more contingency in order to profit more of their power to to transform the virtual in surplus value. That's one thing. So to preoccupy the future and thereby foreclosing the avenir, obviously. And on the side of the individual subjects, there is not only it's not only the case that subjectivation processes are court-circuited, short-cutted. It's not only that, our individuation processes are short-cutted because of the huge individualization and so on. It's also something more. It's that they are thrown in an absolute competition against each other at the level of the digital pheromone, meaning that they are never normal enough. In a system where you don't know what is normal and what is not normal, what is legal and what is not legal, as algorithm replace legality, you are never sure, you know. So for example, what makes Uber drivers perform is maybe less the surveillance exercised by the platform and the authority exercised by the platform, but it's much more the fear that their competitor will be more agreeable to the customers. For example, in Belgium, we had the case that some Uber drivers didn't impose their customers to wear masks, whereas it was compulsory at the time during the pandemic, because they were afraid that my competitor will not impose his customer to wear masks. And you see how they become, even in their bodily integrity, how they become incredibly vulnerable. It rejoins a little bit what, for example, Jasbir Puhar expressed when saying the kind of biopolitics, if we can still speak of biopolitics today, which I'm not sure at all, it's not a human biopolitics. It's a more than human biopolitics and a less than human biopolitics, where the instrumental unit is not the body, it's not the group, it's not the category, it's not the racial origin and so on. It's the data, it's the infra-individual data. And that is absolutely horrific. So what could we do? Because I don't want to leave you in deep despair, as desperate as I am. As I said, I really believe, and then I come to the law and the Constitution, if I may, just 5 minutes. As I said, I really believe, but what is obliterated, what is repressed in this system? What is repressed is the not yet there. It's the materiality of the world, because, you know, I would say l'enfer est pavé de bonnes abstractions. It's the abstraction that is really evil here. Huh? I really believe, so it is the potentiality of materiality that is, you know, what we experience in algorithmic gouvernementalité is a kind of immunization of capitalism from, it's a system, it's a super anti-effraction system. Huh? Anti-effraction, what could make effraction? Materiality could make effraction. You know, people of blood and bones could make effractions. The needs of people could make effraction. But it's an anti-effraction system. It's a closure of the computational against everything that is not computable. Against true uncertainty, not just computable contingency, but true contingency. So the crucial thing is building a future that has not, building a critique from a future that has not arisen, presuppose building a scene, a space-time, a heterochrony, an hyperstition, or write a constitution, where not the past, but the future may emerge as persona, as impersonal singularity, with claims on the present. A critique built from a future is another aporia, another hyperstition. Not only do written constitutions span the absence of origin, they also thwart and renew the absence of recipients of the written commitment towards a people who are missing, a people that always exceeds its present representations. The possibility to address a critique to the present in the name of the yet to come is at the heart of constitutional inscription as I understand it. Of course, using the word constitution, what I have in mind is the absolutely aporetic character of the constitutional moment as heterochronic moment par excellence, an efficient ritual ensuing in an hyperstitional mode of writing, the being over time of a people that always misses and overcomes itself. Against the dehistoricizing imaginary disinstitution of this society propelling and propelled by digital capitalism, the word constitution evokes a task Nietzsche assigned to nature to breed an animal that is permitted to promise. What I have in mind is a notion of the constitution that allows for the breaking into the present of everything that is only there in the form of stigmata or prefiguration, and committing to the actual, the taming actualization, to not exhaust or neutralize the virtual. The contrary of digital abstraction and gluttonous recursivity, an extreme attention to and support for processes of mattering. What is at stake, what must be defended against the preemptive power temporality of algorithmic gouvernementality is an openness of time, or an heterochronicity, which is also a precondition for the possibility of justice, as Jacques Derrida reminds us in Spectres of Mars. No justice seems possible or thinkable without the principle of some responsibility beyond any living present, beyond optimization, I mean. In that which disjoins the living present before the ghosts of those who are not yet born or who are already dead, victims or not of wars, of political or other violence, of nationalist, racist, colonialist, sexist and other exterminations, of the oppressions of capitalist imperialism or of all forms of totalitarianism. Without this non-contemporaneity of the living present to itself, without what secretly misaligns it, without this respect for justice towards those who are not there, not yet there, who have not left traces yet, those who are no longer or not yet present and alive, what sense would there be in asking the question where tomorrow, whither? And I leave you with that quote from Jacques Derrida for now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Antoinette. I'm sorry for the... As you may have seen, we had to change the room because there was a problem. So now we are in this room and we have this. So sorry for that. So thank you very much for your two talks. It was absolutely great, and I would have many things to say. I don't want to say many things now, but maybe just I can ask two questions to open the discussion, and then if anybody wants to add something, of course we can take questions from the public. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to. So the first question is just on a specific point for you, Antoinette, maybe, and maybe it's not a central point, but I just wanted to say that. And then the other question is for both of you. And so the first question was about the fact that from what I understood from what you have said, at a few moments you were saying something like, we are all becoming capitalists, and this is what we want, or this is adapted to our desires, or something like that. And also you quoted someone who was saying, this is a new humanism, like something like that. I don't remember the name of the author. That okay. So I just wanted to say something on this, saying that don't you think that these desires are also produced by a power, precisely? Because, I mean, I'm not sure that this is really what we want, in a way. And also, I'm asking that because, you know, it is in Bernard's thoughts, this is the question of psychopower. You may know that already, but I think it's important because it's really linked with his criticism of consumerism and economy of attention, and you know, it's also, he makes a step beyond Foucault on this point, beyond biopower, saying, okay, now we don't have just biopower, but we also have psychopower, and psychopower means our psyche are produced by these technical systems, which are which belongs to, as you said many times, which belongs to the vectorialist class or whatever we call it. But you see what I mean? Like, we have a power who has the technologies, and these technologies are producing also our drives or our desire. And I know I'm asking also because I know that you didn't agree completely with Bernard's distinction between drive and desire, and this is I mean for but if we accept this distinction, we would say that we are all yes, I mean, okay, so but you know there is all this reflection about destruction of desire and that, so.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and that's very relevant questions. Yes, I had to be very fast, saying we all want to be capitalists. It's not so true. Maybe as all I said, you know, it's not full truth. It's impossible to say the full truth. Anyway, it depends. I think what I had in mind is the background question in my mind. Is it not because the deliberative model of democracy grounded on the concern for the common, you know, for the common good, and so on, for the impersonal value of the common good, is contested today as a rational base for social consistency, and because the only rational base that is perceived today is the self-interest of each individual, aggregating or clustering, you know, that in fact all these, we have allowed all these systems to proliferate and to be beneficial and so on. So that was the background, the background question. No, saying we all wish these systems. I'm not sure, for example, that Uber driver or the digital laborers of the platforms really want these systems. It's just that they are not stupid. They know the rules. They know much better than any of us. I think they know how algorithms work, and they have no other choice in order to survive, to win their bread, to play by the rules and be in competition. So the problem is at the level of the infrastructure. It's not a question of biopower, psychopower. I don't agree at all with that thesis of psychopower. I think really that's, for me, I don't think it works. It takes it's in the continuation, if you wish, of the cultural turn, saying, well, we have to tell people how systems work because they are naive, they don't know where they are, they don't know what they do, and so on. This kind of patronizing way of considering that people act out of their unconscious being manipulated. I think it's much more complicated than that. Before speaking of psychopower, I would first speak of the brutality of neoliberal capitalism and the way, in fact, people are managed on the workplace. And that's, I think, much more coercive than psychopower. Of course, there are economies of addictions and so on. It coexists. But I don't say that the center of gravity of the of the governmental rationality is of psychopower. And I agreed, in fact, with the distinction between pulsion and desire. It's Mauricio Lazzarato who didn't, I think. Agree. I was quite
driving.
Yes, I don't know if
No, perfect. Thank you very much. No, it's much clearer the way you clarify it, and it's interesting also this disagreement on the question of. I mean, I don't know what.
It's also it's a question of strategy. If I say yes, I buy psychopower and we are powerless because we are manipulated from everywhere and so on, that's, that's a discourse that is really disempowering, completely disempowering. I think we have to rely on our capacities to elevate ourselves as Bernard told us.
Yes, of course. So I thank you very much. Maybe if there are some questions, we can. Yes, Zana.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very stimulating, both of you. And I have a question actually for both of you, different ones. Dan, I was wondering, you were speaking about the fourth memory. And it so happens that somebody yesterday told me that Yves Citon also has invented a fourth retention. So I'm curious about these fourth retentions and fourth memories that are coming in. So Yves Citon would have been the data that's collected of us would be the fourth. You give the immune system as the fourth retention. So clearly there's something we are looking at. But in Bernard's system, it seems to me that the memories, they are always, it's the quoi related to the qui. So it's something related to the someone. And so the three memories that we have, they are always some things. That's the DNA and experience and technical things. But now I'm not so sure in what sense the immune system would be the quoi. It would seem to me that maybe the virus would be the quoi, or the bacterium, whatever intruder would be the quoi, the biological intruder would be the thing that invades me and brings into me the fourth something. But you say that it's the immune system, so I'm wondering in what sense this explication of the memory in terms of quoi and qui fits in there. And then to give you a moment of a little time of reflection, I was also asking Antoinette. So I was wondering, in this world in which we are very much, so to say, victims after all over huge governmentality, what would be the citizen skills that we need to develop here? Because I'm really interested in, first of all, the empowering thing, what empowers us. And also, I think that the answer would never be just get rid of the digital governance. It's not possible. We are within it, and it's not only that we are not only looking for I don't know, visibility and spectacularity. We are citizens and we are workers in a digital world, and it's very difficult to become the active, responsible citizen of it. So how can I become a responsible citizen and do the right thing? How can I be a university professor and do the right thing when I feel crushed by this university governance or state governance or elections or whatever? It's not just a commercial system, it's also, as you said, the administration of our working life and citizen life, which is at stake. So how do I do the right thing? What are the citizen skills? How are they changed? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, I didn't know about Yves Citon claiming that there's a fourth kind of memory, but obviously I now have to go to war with Yves Citon and destroy his idea. One thing that I've been thinking during this conference is about the way that I think about how to get into Bernard's thought and the way that people usually get into it, and that there's a little bit of a difference there. What I feel is that, and this is not a criticism at all, that people's way in is through Techniques and Time 1. And it's right to do that because this is the statement of his thesis about techniques, about the who and the what. But it's not where he begins to think. It's the point at which he arrives when he writes Techniques and Time. And where he begins, he also tells you. He begins when he's in a situation of a deprived milieu, and he reads Aristotle on the three kinds of souls and Hegel on the relationship between potential and act in relation to those three kinds of souls. In doing that, he's already in a kind of thought that is saying that we have to make distinctions. Aristotle is essentially right to make these distinctions, but we need to rethink how to conceive them today. And secondly, that we have to think about these distinctions in terms of potential and act, which really means for him the spirals of tendencies and counter-tendencies, which is already the question of entropy, even though he's not foregrounding that in the beginning. But it's there from the moment he begins to think. And so for me, this question of the three kinds of memories is the starting point of his thought, prior to the question of the who and the what, which is a question of the relation of two kinds of memories to a third kind of memory. For me, the interest in the immune system is not so much about this question of who is the friend and who is the enemy, but in the fact that to designate a friend or an enemy is a matter of interpretation. Because Bernard's philosophy at its heart is about the necessity of keeping open the possibility of interpretation against its tendency to close and turn into information. And what I'm trying to suggest here is that what we can gain from conceiving it in terms of an immunitary system is not really anything about friends and enemies, although it's not bad to think about friends and not necessarily bad, but that it gives us a new way to think what is at stake or what is the mechanism of interpretation when you say it's a question of a highly sensitive instrument within a system of supersaturation, and where the risk then is always that supersensitivity can default and fail, and those failures can maybe sometimes be productive, but they also are the production of the pharmacos, they're the regression to war and so on. So it's the question of virus and bacteria, of course, this has to be in there, but what I'm suggesting today is more that it gives us a way of thinking about interpretation and what is lost when interpretation is lost. And what's lost is the sensitivity to have the knowledge to negotiate tension, and that we're living in a time of a collapse of tension.
Antoinette, I'll just say something. Antoinette is going to answer, then Erich wanted to speak, Giuseppe and Paolo. Okay? So we are going to do in the and Michel too. Okay? Yep.
Yes, I think that's an immensely difficult question, but I think the kind of semiotic critique is a precondition for any kind of incapacitation. For any kind of constitution as well, I think. And in fact, what preempts individuals to act rather than to contribute or be resorbated in the machinery as vectors and targets of algorithmic governmentality at the same time. It's an accumulation of reductions. There has been a lot of reductions, and if I may, I have a little list of these kinds of reductions, which I think, if we manage collectively to argue with power and effect that we should reopen, reinstitute difference in between these reductions, we might find ways. I don't know, it's unpredictable, but it might leave some space-time for action. So the kind of reductions which are really toxic, and I think in fact they are toxic because they deny the primary retentions, the secondary retentions, and the tertiary retentions. It means all these reductions that I will list, they deny all the epiphylogenetic milieu that Bernard has elucidated or has brought to the fore. So those reductions is first a reduction, and you can see those reductions even in the text of the European bureaucracy. In the text of the European Commission, for example, you see these reductions. The reduction of the status of citizen to the status of consumer user. The reduction of politics to the juxtaposition of individual interest or sectorial logics. Reduction of the people who is missing, the people avenir, to actual, present, real-time registration or representation, digital representation. The reduction of the to come, the avenir, to the optimization of state of fact or the facticity. The reduction of the virtual to real-time. The reduction of social justice to post-actuarial calculation. Detection in real time of specific individual risk, which is an oxymoron, of course. The reduction of justice to the law, to the state of the law today. The reduction of hermeneutics to digital seismography. The reduction of imagination and creation to innovation. The reduction of prospective to extrapolation of past tendencies. Reduction of work to employment, the reduction of the plasticity and alterability of life to the execution of a genetic program, the reduction of life to flaws of digital information, reduction of human person to the sum of the recorded, digital recorded interactions, the reduction of the public to the audience, the reduction of the just measure to high resolution, the reduction of people to their behaviors, reduction of existence to pure presence, which is dead for Derrida, reduction of singularities to symptoms, and so on and so on. If we redeploy the difference between these terms, then we may have a constitutional moment. If not, we are done. We are finished. C'est foutu, and it's apocalypse.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, Erich.
Okay, thank you both of you. I have first a short remark for Dan. It's already also a little question part, and then for both of you, just I wanted to negotiate between your both interventions. Dan, I wondered that you, when you spoke about the immune system, the paradigm you invoked of the immune system as the difference or the differentiating mechanism of friend and enemy. I mean, this is, of course, very common, let's say the military, or according to Schmidt, the political model of the immune system. But there exists a very strong other paradigm of the immune system. Beginning of 1970s, Varela and Ansbach started to develop it. rethinking immunology in a direction of an, as they call it, reenactment of Gaia inside the body, right? And it turned out to be, in the end, there was a famous paper of Gilbert, Sepp, and Cowers. They introduced the concept of symbiosis to do so. But what they did is they do not start from an already constituted biological individual constantly engaged in a defensive struggle, right? But they start from, they say there are co-evolutionary somatic processes of individuation, they use the word individuation, to take place in autonomous immunonetworks. So I wonder if this would, in your argument, if this would, I mean, it's interesting, maybe more interesting even to work with this paradigm if you say that's maybe a fourth form of memory, right? So it's a remark, but also a question. And I wanted to ask you, you negotiate your concepts of law, because Dan, that's the second question, maybe Dan said, yeah, law is or introduced law as a mechanism of mental stabilization, right? And so this is echoing a bit the image of law as a mere stabilizing moment, right? And I wonder, is there maybe another image of law, or do we have to change our image of law, maybe in a direction, let's say, that law as an agent of transformation? So, yeah, it's a huge question, but somehow in the room, the elephant in the room, I have the impression, we should discuss. Yeah.
Okay. I think it seems to be understood scientifically. Other people can talk about this with much more authority than I can, that the immune system is very complex and multifunctioned. And it's not my intention at all to reduce it to something, but it's to say that it works by what seems not to be in question from what I can understand is that it works by cutting off, you know, that it keeps the past. It literally keeps the past in order to organize the future in whatever way. And that it does this entirely separately from the nervous system in the sense that it's sensing something, but you don't know that you the possessor of a nervous system, don't know this. The who of the nervous system doesn't know this, but the who that is the immune system does. And yes, it may be that introducing a kind of co-evolutionary paradigm makes it a better argument, but that's something that would need to do work to say more about it. What's also important is that it's not for Bernard to, when you talk about three kinds of memory, that there are no other distinctions to be made. It's that these are sort of fundamental distinctions. When something improbable and new really happens in the world, at some point a being begins to have something like a nervous system. And this also is the case for the immune system. So it's an event in the world, and the characteristics of it are one thing, but what we can say is that it's related for sure to questions of speed in the environment of that kind of being, because a vertebrate is a being that changes more slowly than a virus. And genetics has a limited capacity to deal with this situation. And so to get to your question of law, I mean, the first thing to say is that metastabilization is not stabilization.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if it sounds like it, then, and in a lot of the time, that's what it looks like, right? But the question of an image of law, well, a constitution is slow for a very good reason. You know, and most of the time in history, it's good that it's slow, because the faster processes go, the more risk you have that you make wrong, that you go in a wrong way, and so you deliberately build in slowness, and I connect it to DNA because it's not unchangeable, a constitution, but it's very difficult to change, which means it takes time to change. And this, everybody can see that this is a problem, and for instance, how much the United States is a prisoner now of a political system where so much time and money and power is necessary to win presidential elections and congressional elections and so on, that there's no possibility that anybody can see of how you can escape this, and yet this fundamental aspect of the Constitution, you can't conceive how it can possibly change short of a revolution either. So sometimes people suggest new mechanisms, like we have direct, why not use the internet to vote directly on laws and so on, to cope with the speed of change and to increase participation and so on. You can understand very clearly those arguments, but they never get you out of the risk of what happens when you say, okay, we'll do. Then you're on the way to automating your own political process in another way. Slowness is necessary. So it's very, yes, we can call for some new conception of law, but ultimately, every conception of law is a question of writing. And what we're talking about here is a relationship between writing and something else that works much faster. And you can compose the two, but only by introducing the risk of digital technologies into the risk of the slowness of writing. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't know how you can solve this problem, but it's a real one. That's what I'm suggesting.
I must say I quite agree with all you have said about the law. In fact, the materiality of law is a long and slow sedimentation of text and interpretations of text which become law after a while, especially in civil law countries. It's a bit different because the jurisprudence have not the same normative weight as in common law countries. Although, in fact, because civil law lawyers may be afraid of taking too much risk in their own interpretation, the imagination of the judge is usually quite limited, and he works like a machine learning algorithm from time to time, especially because there is not enough public funding in the public service of justice, especially in Belgium. It's like that. Judges, one say the justice as public service doesn't work well because cases to be judged take too long and so on. You have to wait too long. So let's replace judges by algorithms and robots. It will be expeditive, and in a way, it guarantees a better access to justice, which is also a fundamental right. And Belgium has been condemned by the European Court of Human Rights for breaching of that obligation to access in a reasonable time delay to justice. So there are arguments for that. We could also say, let's consider justice and the justice system as a priority, more than buying guns and planes, and invest massively to hire more judges and give them more time to do their job properly. That would be another option, which I think is more sustainable. But as for also a virtue of law, maybe is like Pierre Legendre, who's a lawyer and psychoanalyst, said. He says it's a dogmatics. It's dogmatic. It has a dogmatic groundings for sure. It carries huge ideologies, values, and so on. But it's a dogmatics which is conscious of itself, and for that reason, it has organized its own system of questioning and challenging its own production. through all the system, you know, of judicial review and appeal and so on, and the evolution. That's the living metabolism of law. That's what makes the life of law. For me, a little bit like Deleuze said also, that written law, it's just politics. It's the result of democratic deliberation, ideally. Democratic deliberation. It's politics, it's not law. What is law is jurisprudence. It's the decisions taken by the judge. And indeed, for the people, that's what counts. What counts for the people is the decisions that will be made by a judge in each singular situation. And what a robot cannot do, of course, a robot can correct itself, or an algorithm, a learning machine, for example, a self-driving car, can correct its own algorithms if someone dies. Okay, oh, that's, well, the error has been made and it can feel it, you know? But when, for example, an algorithm judges quite badly about the risk of recidivism of a person that has asked for a conditional liberation, he was prisoner, and the algorithm says no, there is no really touchable shock to be felt. The algorithm cannot feel it has been wrong because nothing happened, because there was no event that can be sensible. You see? So that's the reason why we cannot replace the work of a judge by a machine. The singularity of the situation cannot be felt and never be corrected. I'm also I find fascinating that idea of democratic singularity. And you know, there are these projects of lean nation, agile nation, sponsored by the OCDE, saying that, in fact, democratic processes, lawmaking and so on, it's much too slow to deal with the technological revolution, with the challenges of climate change and so on. It's too slow. So let's replace all this by lean government, by agile nation, meaning algorithms. You see? So there is a huge push for that. But I think that kind of democratic singularity, recording everyone's inferred preference by recording everyone's digital pheromones all the time, and inferring, for example, your personal preferences on that subject, and aggregating the votes of your avatars. That kind of democratic singularity is, in fact, that's really apocalypse, because people are able to rush and that's the difference between pulsion and desire as well. People are able to build rational preferences because they are able to discuss against each other, because they're exposed in a public space, which is to each other a space where things have not been made for them, and so on. So yes, that's it. I'm not sure it responds to the question, but law doesn't work very well. It's a very dysfunctional system, the system of law. But because it's dysfunctional, because it's not adequate to the spontaneity of the world, it is a matter for contestation. And we will never arrive to a perfect law. A perfect law would be equal to justice, and as Derrida says very well, justice is really unattainable. But that difference, and taking into account that difference, is so important.
Yes. Thank you very much. So, Giuseppe?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for your nice talks. I like very much your approach to the immune system, disregarding radically, all the war metaphors that are just distorting knowledge. I would like to stress something you hinted to, that there is something deeply in common between the neural system, brain, and the immune system. Indeed, it's not by chance that Edelman, who first worked at the Darwinian nature of the immune system, then moved to the neural Darwinism. Because in both cases, there is an explosion of diversity, a permanent production of diversity, and then selection as permanence of what works. What is working remains the brain connections and the active components of the immune system. So these two systems happen to be the two components of an organism that are most concerned with the interaction with the ecosystem. So it seems that an organism interacts with an ecosystem by the very same structure that makes us understand the ecosystem, namely Darwinian evolution. We do have evolutionary systems exactly to be in an evolutionary context. And in both cases, of course, the notion of memory is crucial, because that's exactly how historicity works. It is the memory of the past that contributes to shape by canalizing the action in future. And so again, memory is a common feature of both systems. And there is no need of word terminology, but just the positive selection of the components that are active, which allows also to be perfectly in peace, with no war at all, with so many bacteria that inhabit in our body. I like this, and perhaps I can even try to make a connection with what you said, because after all, historicity is in common. I mean, the historicity of evolution is what fits with the ecosystem, the immune system, the brain. Memory is a component of historicity, and probably what you said shares in the construction of the law, constitution as a moment of stabilizations of an historical dialectics. For some reason, we decide a component of our historical dialectics deserves a stabilization that goes beyond with the practice of everyday law. And of course, this is always a result of interpretation. But there is an interpretation where there is historical construction of sense. So when a process is hit by something coming from outside, then there is interpretation, the way it modifies the very process.
Yes.
And this is common to, I think, to the three systems you have been evocating. I am not for an organicist interpretation of society and law, but there is a common grounding in historicity and in sort of interplay between memory and a Darwinian process, in a sense, again.
Completely agree.
Yes, and it's not. I want to agree that it's not a question of organicism. It's a question of conceiving the composition of different retentional layers, let's say, and the way that this composition functions protensionally, to talk in a slightly jargonistic way. And I want to say, what matters is, if we're doing an homage to Stiegler's thought, to identify the necessities of the future of that thought and the dangers that the future of that thought faces. And I think one is to make the concept of diversity something very superficial, because diversity is there's a universal agreement about diversity being a virtue today. Everybody loves diversity, and so the easiest thing in the world today is to stand up and make a speech that says we need diversity. Nobody in the world is going to disagree with you at all, even the strongest nationalist person, because it's his diversity that he cares about. The risk is to start to conceive diversity as like a question of rainbows. That it's the rainbow of sexuality, the rainbow of cultures, and so on, and which ultimately becomes what makes it possible to accommodate the notion of diversity to calculable systems. Because a rainbow, you can break it out. You're red, you're orange, you're yellow. Whereas in fact, it's not that at all. Diversity is the outcome of the fact that singular processes, which means that they're an unfolding constant crisis, are in tension with each other and produce new possibilities of interpretation. And so yes, I'm completely agreeing with what you're saying, but what I'm saying is that presents us with a challenge politically or philosophically to make sure we take care of the risk that we forget what diversity really means in the way that we learn about it from Stiegler, and instead let it become what everybody else wants it to mean, which is something very flat, or else a big war between all of the diverse particularities.
Yeah. I think it reminds me of the notion of the non-inhuman in Stiegler, when he says the non-inhuman it's his way, I think, to not particularize and to valorize the impersonal singularity and the impersonal, but also the undefined singularity that he says is not recognizable and is not in our technical or digital systems. And I think that's that non-inhuman, that double negativity is something quite important, because it avoids the categorization, it avoids the rainbow. I think it's what comes is the avenue.
Okay, Paolo.
Yes, thank you very much to both of you. Very interesting thoughts. Well, I would have a question for Dan, but it's very complex, and so I will speak with Dan in another moment. And well, I have two remarks on your talk, Antoinette. The first is about you say that gouvernementalité is not a non-striated space, and a not striated space. So it's not a smooth space, as the reservoir would say. It's a striated space, precisely because you say there are point of view. Algorithms are not neutral. Algorithms come from some point of view, and I totally agree with you. And there's a friend of us that is Mitra Zah that talks about POV optical. It's no more a panopticon, because it's a point of view optical, and this point of view comes from algorithm, as you say. At the same time, in your text, there is the presence of such a smooth space. When you say, for instance, it seems like the dream of immanence comes true, or the fact that there is a perception of immanence, and such an immanence is generated by algorithms. So there is an articulation of smooth and striated space within algorithmic gouvernementality. This is what I can understand by your text. It's not a striated space, but it's not a smooth space. It's an articulation of the two. And this is totally consistent with the reservatory theory of the two kinds of spaces.
Yes.
And then this is only a comment. The other is about psychopower. You said that before talking about psychopower, it would be better to talk about the neoliberal violence and coercion that is present in our reality. And so I can agree with you on this point. But so is this moment of coercion this moment of coercion, to me, indicates a rest of disciplinary power, a rest of something that is not absorbed by the algorithmic regime. It's something more. It's something that rests beside the algorithmic governmentality. This is true. But the question is this moment of coercion and violence within or outside algorithmic governmentality? Is something that precedes or something that is just beside or intertwined with algorithmic governmentality? This is the question. And just two words about Stiegler's psychopower. So there are another philosopher, the Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han, that talks about psychopower. But in fact, it is another declination, another meaning of psychopower. And Han's psychopower, to me, is precisely what you said about psychopower, something that is a disempowerment of citizens and users. It's a disempowerment because it's something set. It's really set. Like Adorno and Horkheimer, when they developed their critique of industrial, of the cultural industries, they are very set in the sense that they not provide an alternative or a counter effect of such a psychopower. While Bernard, has this kind of pharmacological approach. And in some texts, Bernard said that no politics, that is something proactive, that is something normative in a positive way, no politics must come from psychopower. So psychopower and the notion of power in this sense is very Foucauldian. It's something that not repress, not just repress. It's something that let us do something, and by limiting us. But it let us do something. So in this moment, we can, if we follow Bernard, we can counter-effect the elements of psychopower and generate no politics. So elements for the reappropriation of technology, of right, of law, of politics, and etc. And so it's a way to re-empower citizens and users. It's a pharmacological way to re-empower. So this is only a comment about psychopower, and the question is the other. Thank you very much.
So before you answer, so what you're saying is, she got the simple question and mine's too complicated to talk about here. Okay.
You want this question?
No. But I'm afraid of my question.
Yes, thank you. First, you had a notion that has been very inspirational for me, which was your paraphrase of Walter Benjamin, the immanent reproduction of immanence, the technical reproduction of immanence. Yes. And that's, you had it all with that expression, I think, in one of your texts. Smooth space, striated space. I would say, if one there are different layers. There are different layers of abstraction. And if you see algorithmic governmentality from the point of view of the algorithm, because that is from the inner of the machine, from the gaze without eyes of the machines, then you are in a space which is neither smooth nor striated, which is folded, which is like an accordion, that you don't open completely. You have that point of view, and optimization is the selection among all the possible possibles of the optimal possible that corresponds to the function the function of the algorithm, to the utility of the vectorialist class member, if I can say so. Then you have that point of view. From the point of view of the individualized user-consumer, you have the impression of a smooth space. The disappearance of authority. Authority doesn't appear assumed by any concrete individual person, big brother or something like that. No, you are in the immanence of your daily lives, and you don't even recognize or you don't care. It's not even, you know, it's not even the hegemony. It's not, you don't participate as a consequence of a culturalist turn or hegemony. It's by the shrug. You don't mind so much, you know. Yeah, you know that you shouldn't spend so much time on Facebook, but who cares? Or you shouldn't retweet this stupid thing that Trump has sent, but it's funny though, so who cares? You know, it's the shrug. And I think that's the reason why it's neither an anarchic space, because you have that accordion view, neither a completely striated space, because people don't feel, and the striated space or discipline works only if people feel the gaze that is on them. It's a mode of discipline. Discipline functions through the functioning of a gaze, or a phantasmatic gaze, even in the panopticon. It's not like that. We've never been so invisible in a way, and as calculable as today. It's not through the... So it's something new, I would say, something new. But of course, it functions differently for different groups of people. For some people, for those who in the winter are on their bike and giving food to people who don't want to go out because it's raining, for example, those ones are the new slaves of the platform economy, and they are very much disciplined. They feel like a discipline, their constant evaluation, and you know, it's disciplinary. But for me, who I'm at home and I just had to click on my computer to get someone to give me food, I'm the master, and I'm on the evil part of, you know, I'm on the part of the exploiters. And I enjoy that very much. It's a politics. It's enjoyable. Everything, and I can eat a lot, and I'm on the part of the gulaf. You see, so it's disparate, and it doesn't affect everybody in the same way. That's the reason why, just looking like people who say they are doing AI ethics, for example, they look at the black box and try to render the black box virtuous and fair and accountable and transparent. That's just bullshit, because you just try to make a technical subsystem assume all the virtues that should be present in all the society. So, like the poem of T.S. Eliot, they dream of machines so perfect that they do not have to be good anymore. It's exactly like that. So we have to what's interesting is the intrications of these different kinds of power. As for psychopower is too general. Maybe when I'm addicted to Netflix or so, and I don't sleep anymore because I'm in a kind of a psychopower. But I have a lot of addictions. I drink coffee too much. I have a lot of... It's not very specific. Some people are even addicted to work, which is not my case. You see, it's not so specific, I think. And people, I suspect people like that figure of psychopower because it's disresponsibilizing. You know, I'm addicted. It's like a disease. You know, it's not something of my choice. It's a disease. It's something that is imposed on me, and that I don't have to give account for to be accountable for that. Yes. As for the no power, the no politics that can come from psychopower, I would like to believe in that, really, that that from these dispositives that they could make us free, really, and more autonomous, but the problem is that as long as we are in a neoliberal capitalist system where we are all in competition with all others, because we are evaluated in real time all the time against the performances of all others, including for our presence on social networks and so on, we have to be present all the time. I'm afraid that ideal of no politics using these systems remain a possibility, but probably for an elite, not for everyone. That's the reason why we need maybe a critique, a materialist critique of the old kind.
Okay, thank you very much. So Michel is going to ask his question, and maybe I will.
I also saw 2 hands raised in the chat, but then it disappeared, so I'm not really sure.
Okay.
Yeah, Simon.
What we can do is that you I'm sorry, because the time is running a bit, so maybe you can ask what you wanted to ask, Michel. I just wanted to say a little things about diversity, if I may, just after you. And maybe we can have these questions after Paolo and Sarah's talk. I'm very sorry for that, but I mean, it's complicated. Okay. So.
Well, it's a very short question, and it goes to both of you, because I think that in your 2 talks, there was something important about institutions. You have not developed this issue, but you mentioned it, right? So Dan, for example, you said that these mid-scale experiments might perhaps produce a bigger legal change, right? And then you also said that it is about to produce new possibilities of interpretation. So perhaps these institutions should be interpreting too, right? So what these institutions might look like in a what to come, according to what you said. And this also relates to what you said when you quoted Zizek. Instead of changing the word, we should interpret it again, right? And especially because algorithmic governmentality does not produce an order. On the contrary, it produces a constant disorder, this society, or a society which is not governable at all, to put it at Wolfgang Streeck, right? So the same question goes to you. What new institutions might look like? Because obviously you're not for anarchism. Anarchism is not a solution, if I understood you correctly.
Yeah.
Okay, good. The first answer is I don't know. But Bernard's idea, I think, is all around this question and how you can create systems that tend to produce, or institutions that tend to produce a clash of points of view that leads to new interpretations in the tendency of that institution. But what I would want to say about that is, and that's what, you know, his economic ideas were about in terms of new accounting systems and new ways of dealing with work, and also with ligne de temps and things like that. But I also want to say something about that in relation to the distinction between power and knowledge. Bernard says something like that power is synchronic and knowledge is diachronic. But that's hard to understand exactly, because power makes changes too, and so what exactly does that mean? And it's an easy distinction in a way, because you can easily identify the good and the bad, right? Knowledge is good and power is bad, but even if it's a composition. But I think we can complicate it and make it harder for ourselves in a way that's actually beneficial. There's somewhere else where he says, and I can't remember exactly where it is, something like, culture is always a form of control. And this is not control in the Deleuzian sense, but in the sense that it's a programming of the future intergenerationally. In other words, there's a virtuousness of control. What he cared about, as far as I could see, to a large extent was several things, but one of the main things that he cared about is forms of suffering that arise in the world. And one of the problems with that flat form of diversity, I think, is that it only identifies certain kinds of suffering and decides in advance what they are. But in fact, there are other kinds of suffering today. And those kinds of suffering are connected with what you feel when you don't have control, not just don't have control over yourself, don't have control applied to you, a good kind of control. In other words, education, which is also another name for culture, is always a kind of control in the sense that it's a real taking care that tries to program your future in a virtuous way. And the distinction from power then can be understood. Power is what tries to program that future to always be synchronic, as much as possible. Control then is what tries to raise you to be capable of taking control yourself, having an agency in your own individuation. And so it's not just a question of how to organize institutions. It's fundamentally a question of the destruction of education at every single level of life today, from the baby that is born to the child that is at school to the student at the university who's being inducted into research, and in so many dimensions, as I said to you this morning, the education is completely being destroyed because it cannot make the distinction between power and control. It can make the distinction between power and knowledge, but that's easy, because you can keep destroying everything by calling it being free and letting people do what they want and not teaching them anything, not raising them to be capable of their individuation. So I would say that, first of all, the most important question is really how to undo the multi-dimensional processes of the destruction of education, because if that is not done, nothing else is possible, and you cannot have interpretation, and if you cannot have interpretation, you cannot have law, and if you cannot have law, you cannot have the difference with justice.
That's perfect. I just add something, because when there are several authors speak of very different animals when saying institutions. For example, for Pierre Legendre is the place vide peuplée, the empty populated place. It's the place of institutions are the place or the location of impersonal singularity and the common. For David Hume, it's something completely different. For David Hume, and this rejoins your concern about education, because David Hume says institutions are the way through which agents are forced to transcend the natural partialities of their sympathies, to transcend the partialities of their natural sympathies. Through institutions, people are obliged to consider something else than pure optimization of their own interests. So we should institutionalize the GAFAM, for example. All the vectorialist class is ill-educated because they are not instituted enough, I think. And so are people. The capacity to take into consideration the common thing that is irreducible to the juxtaposition of individual interests. You know, it's a condition also for epistemic democracy. There is no epistemic democracy if people are not able to take into consideration things that really transcend their pure personal, individual, particular interest in real time. That's what I wanted to ask. But institutions are absolute, and there is also, yes, and then there is Kallinikos, Yanis Kallinikos, who says that institutions are the way, he speaks of institutional orderings whereby the fugitive nature of social interaction is molded to a stable social pattern that recur across societal fields. And I think the confusion between power and control comes from the fact that these institutional orderings are perceived as something which is imposed without reason and without contestation, and which are performed by individuals by conformism, by an effect of conformism. And I think we have to interpret these institutions in order to see, to re-evaluate their reasons, the reasons why they are there, and so on. And that's a task of interpretation. The institutions should not just be perpetuated like that. They should be interpreted in order for people to not only to believe in them, but to be part to their metabolism and evolution.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to add a little thing, if it's okay, but maybe
you're
just
the boss.
What?
You're the boss.
Yes, I should. Okay, so I allow myself to ask a little last thing, which is just about diversity. What you said about diversity, because it is linked to the first question that I wanted to ask to both of you, I think, which was at the beginning the question of deterritorialization, if I may say it like that. So what I wanted to say is that if you told us then that if we wanted to have a strong concept of diversity, we should, yes, be careful not to have a too loose concept, or I don't know what. So I guess if we have to have a strong concept of diversity, and we should also link it with the question of locality, because I think it is a very, it's very abstract to speak about diversity without or avoiding the question of locality, even if the question of locality is complicated. And what I wanted to say is that there is a discussion between, I guess Derrida is the first who raised these questions of the fact that technological acceleration is a process of delocalization in a way, and deterritorialization, and so and uniformization and standardization, and this is what he calls le mal d'abstraction. This is why I'm also pointing that, because Antoinette, you spoke about this notion of abstraction, l'enfer est pavé de bonnes abstractions. You said that, so I was wondering if, and you also spoke about deterritorialization, so and reterritorialization. So I just wanted to know if you could explain a bit more this concept, or the view that the point of view you have on this concept, because the thing is that the reflection of Derrida about this, which are in Foi et Savoir, and also in Échographie de la télévision, which is a dialogue with Bernard, and the question is, how can we manage to reconcile this process of technical acceleration and uniformization with what they call idiomaticity and locality and the singularity, in a way. And what Bernard is saying to Derrida in this dialogue is something like, we should, and this, I said that for you then, we should, how you say that in English, ralentir, slow down, but we should also localize. He said, and in order to slow down, we have to localize this process of acceleration. So my question was also to say to you, yes, it's a question of speed, like, yes, the technique is always going faster than the law, but the question is that it's also a question of space, I think, at a certain point, and maybe the way of I know that what Bernard also wanted to do with the research contributory project or something like that was also to try to localize the technical development in a way, or to yes, and I think it's also related to the question of law, because you know at the end of Bifurcate, Alain Suppiot wrote an article which is called The Territorial Inscription of Law, saying that law in a way is always territorialized or localized, or there's no universal law. So I was just thinking if you had some remarks on that, on these points. Both of you.
Yes. What is locality? A locality is firstly what we can call an individuation process, in the sense that it's, as I learned from Giuseppe, like the unfolding of a constant crisis. That means that everything is connected together in its history and in its unfolding over time, in an organized way that if it either continues or it falls apart. And in this way, if locality is the key to diversity, it's firstly because every individual psychic individuation process, every one of us is a locality. And so the diversity means the maintenance of the singularity of those processes against the possibility that they can become standardized and so on, which means recognizing that they are incomplete and so on. And, as you also suggested, law is itself a locality. It's not a universality. It's its own history of interpretation, as Antoinette said. And that means it operates in time and space with certain kinds of speed and in certain directions and so on. And yes, Bernard wanted to have localized economic process, but the question is, the question I'm trying to suggest is difficult, is what is the relationship of those economic localities to law? Because you can want things, but the question is how you get them. And it can be a good idea, but it's also a question of the processes through which you make it possible for it to happen. And they still relate to the same, it doesn't change the fundamental structure that we're talking about here, which is that on the one side you have one kind of retentional speed, and on the other hand you have another, and you can try to compose them, but it's saying you want that doesn't solve the problem itself. And the only way you can solve it is to, the only thing that people can do is to say, well, we try. We try to make law go fast enough and to stay slow enough as well. And it's a question of how you make the impossible possible, I think.
The question of territoriality of law, and indeed, it's also something which is challenged by the brute force of the digital economy. For example, a way to re-territorialize in the boundaries of a specific, for example, European jurisdiction, re-territorialize these questions of the regulation of the practices of the big players of the digital economy, the GAFA and so on. It's very difficult because even in Europe, for example, you have some countries who play the fiscal demagogy. Ireland, for example, in order to attract, of course, business and to attract investments. So that's a huge problem, at the level of regulation. That's the reason also why I tend to insist on the fact that it's not only a question of simple regulation, it's a question of constitution. What matters there, what's at stake is our European constitution, rather than only regulation. Also, of course, but that question of deterritorialization reminds of the definition of capitalism by Deleuze and Guattari, the accelerations of flows in deterritorialized space. And in fact, the data is the texture today of capitalism. It's by definition, it is deterritorialized for the reason also that a data that is not disindexed by reference to a context of reference, material context, has much less value, has much less option value than a data that is completely deconnected and without any kind of meaning. It seems paradoxical, but the less the data is attached to a specific context, materialized context, the more it gains in speculative value. The more the data gains in speculative value, because then it travels light, and it can be correlated in a variety of contexts without taking into consideration and being amnesic of its conditions of production and all the idiosyncrasies that would reduce its computability in a way. But it's a good... I don't have an answer to these problems, but slide that.
Yes. No, but it's interesting to precise this. So thank you very much.